I've got my own little introduction to Mr. Dize prepared here myself, so just want to say a few things. Since I've been at Gunston, Mr. Dize has always been here, and he's always been someone that in the middle of the day I can talk to about fishing, boating, anything bay related, and we kind of go off on our own little tangent, our own little world in those conversations. And I can't even begin to tell you how much I've learned from Mr. Dize since I've been here. And I just want to encourage all of you here to, after this interview, I hope that you're inspired to learn from another person who's in our community, who's a wealth of knowledge. At Gunston, I teach a lot about environmental sustainability, ecological sustainability, and one of the hardest things to understand is culture and tradition, and that falls in the realm of sustainability just as much as anything. And the best way to learn about culture and tradition, and learn about where you're from, is to talk to somebody like Mr. Dize. So, with that being said, my hope is that in this conversation, you gain a new perspective on what it's like to be from this area and from this region, and we can tie that into this idea of living sustainably on today's Earth Day. So, we'll move on to the interview. Mr. Dize, thanks for joining us today.
Nice to be here in a lot of different ways. First of all, my Earth Day shirt is one from 20 years ago. So if you get a chance, read the quote on the back. I designed it, and it's one of my favorite shirts, so I like to wear it out for special occasions like this.
So the first question is, just tell us where you're from, Mr. Dize.
Okay, I'm originally from Crisfield, and it's a very, very small town in Lower Shore. And I guess we want to get into all of that.
What do you like the most about where you're from?
Okay, what I like mostly about being from there was it was like an idyllic kind of place to grow up, because you didn't worry about being abducted. Your parents didn't care if you went out and played out in the field or wandered the woods or the marshes or wherever. You were perfectly safe, and you never had to worry about anything like that. Parents didn't worry about their kids if they were late coming home. They knew they were fine. But the nostalgia is rarely 2020. We all engage in revisionist history. We look back. You probably experienced that with your parents. You have one memory, and you say, "Hey, Mom, Dad, remember this?" And you say, "It didn't quite happen that way." But what I experienced, I know was really that's the way it was. So it was a very safe place to grow up in. You had extended family between my house and my aunt's house. There were 17 houses. I was related to 14 of the 17. So, this gives you a good idea. You also couldn't do anything wrong, because odds are your relatives would see you and turn you in, and the news would get home before you did. So that's the world I grew up in. I'm kind of a walking anachronism, because the world I was brought into doesn't even exist anymore. So that's what nostalgia is for.
So I want to poll the audience for a second. Does anybody here, raise your hand if you know where Crisfield is or have been to Crisfield?
Some of you were probably on the last trip we did to Fox Island.
It's kind of, if you're going to Smith Island, Tangier Island, Fox Island, which you probably aren't going to anymore, unfortunately. That's kind of a launching point. I think I've got it on the map. Here's Crisfield. So we are up here, and Crisfield sits right down on the Maryland-Virginia line. It's kind of you go through Salisbury and you take this long road that is just a big dead end. follows the old train line there, which we might talk about later on, what the importance of that train line there. But yeah, Crisfield, it's just a really ecologically productive part of the bay, pristine area. And we're going to look a little bit more about Crisfield's demographics and how they've changed over time, but I just wanted to give you all a little geography lesson. I always like to do that when we get the chance. So Crisfield, Maryland is, it's about, what, 100 miles south of here? No, not that far.
It's
60?
100 miles.
Okay.
Almost 100 miles, exactly.
Okay. All right. So tell us about the origins of your last name. That's always an interesting story.
Okay, we tried to trace it back as far as we can, and originally started out in Spain as Dize, D-I-A-Z, at about 1000 AD, best we can figure. And then gradually, it being along the coastline, I always lived along the water. They moved up to France, where it became, they wanted to francify it and be Dize, so they had an E-T on the end. And eventually that, over time, became Dize, D-I-Z-E-T. Then he migrated to England, where it became D-I-Z-E. We dropped the French T because, you know, the Frenchies weren't popular in England at that time. And so, and in Elizabethan times, nobody spelled their name the same way twice, it seems like. So there's like 7 or 8 different spellings of my name. It makes it really hard to trace your family back because of the different spellings. Even today, there's 2 different spellings. On Tangier, you'll find D-I-Z-E, but you also find D-I-S-E. So, but it's all from the same person who came as short Jamestown about 1635. Moved to Somerset County about 1665, and been there ever since with a few people like myself who decided the gene pool was too small to dip into, and decided to go elsewhere for a spouse. Yeah, I did go to the prom with my second cousin, by the way. I didn't know that, but my mother explained that. What are you thinking?
So as we go along here, you're going to see, I'm going to go back to the map here. You go out, if you go from Crisfield, Smith Island is right here, where my cursor is, and Tangier is right here. And if you ever go out to these islands or around Crisfield, if you go to a cemetery, it's always something. I've actually had our CWS kids do this before. You walk around the cemetery and you see how many names, how many Dizes you can see, and how many different spellings there are of that name. And it shows just how, over time, your family's been in that area since the 1600s, right? So it shows how over time you have these different branchings from the family, and little pockets of Dizes on different islands, and hence accidentally going to the prom with your second cousin. So there you go. So we are. What we're going to do is, as we go into this, we're going to refer to Smith and Tangier Islands. We're going to put them all together in some of these conversations, and look at the different subcultures that have formed in that area. And these are all different communities that have lived off the environment. So tell me about what your parents did for a living growing up, and what life was like for them, and kind of how it changed when, from generation to generation, between their generation and your generation. And I'm also going to point out, this is it pastel?
No, it's oil painting.
I don't know anything about art. I need to know more. This is an oil painting that Ben Dize did, and I'll have him tell you more about that. But
This is actually a painting I did of my father. This was his job, wheeling oysters in the wintertime. And this is my uncle's crab packing house, an oyster packing house. And you see the shuckers stand in what they call booths. And it's concrete benches, and they shuck oysters. And so my father would leave the house about 5 o'clock in the morning, go down to the packing house, start up the coal fires, and get a little bit of heat in there because the places were damp and cold. And then they'd wheel oysters around to the different shuckers. And in the summertime, we worked in crabs. Everybody in my family, and literally everyone, worked in the seafood business at one time or another. It was that pervasive. There were no other jobs. So as the seafood, and Mr. Hoisington will show you the correlation between the decline in population and the decline in the crabs and oysters and seafood. Over time, it becomes less and less a viable option for a vocation. And even in when I was like your age, and I was wondering what to do with my life, college wasn't an option because we didn't have the money. And my father asked me what I was going to do. I don't know. I don't know, go work on the water. There wasn't really another option. So he said, no, you don't want to do that. This isn't going to last. I mean, he had seen the change in his lifetime when there were mountains and mountains of oysters, and oysters left Crisfield by 100 carloads. It's incomprehensible to us now how incredible the harvest was there, because it's 1% of that now. But that was our family's life. My grandfather owned a skipjack, and he went all the way up and down the bay, so it'd be gone for weeks and weeks at a time. So it was a hard life, and which is why not too many people want to do that anymore.
So you grew up in Crisfield, you kind of dabbled with the life of a waterman, you learned how to work on the water, decided to take a different career path, and ended up in College Park. Can you tell us the story about when you bought your first pizza?
Yeah. Okay, so in Crisfield in 1964, there were no pizza places in town. There was like one restaurant in town. So pizza was like something foreign to me. So when I went to College Park, my roommate said, hey, if you're going downtown, get something to eat, because when you're 18 years old, you're always hungry. You can't get enough to eat. I said, yeah, it's going down a little tavern where you can buy a bag of hamburgers for 15 cents each. I mean, it was heaven. And so he said, hey, pick me up a pizza. I said, oh, okay. I hadn't bought a pizza before. So I picked up the pizza, and I had a bunch of stuff I was carrying, so I slinged a pizza box under my arm. So you know what happens when you do that? You turn a pizza box on its side, all the slices just stack on top of each other. I come back and give it to my roommate, he opens the box, and hey, what'd you do to my pizza, man? So, yeah, it's little cultural things like that was like a big, it took me like 2 years to adjust to urban kind of lifestyle, because it's so totally foreign to me. We didn't get a TV till I was in the 9th grade. So, that's why I became a reader.
So in college, what was your college major?
Art education.
Okay, art and education. So Mr. Dize grows up in Crisfield and becomes an art major at College Park. You can obviously see that he's a pretty talented guy. How did you get into art growing up in Crisfield?
It was just the one thing I was, from the earliest age, I started drawing on my parents' wallpaper when I was like 3, and they said I drew a 12-foot long fish. We were renting an apartment at the time, so my parents had to repaper the whole wall. So fortunately, they didn't make me senseless after that. They encouraged me, and that's how you stay in art.
Can you tell us a little bit about this?
This is a place I worked at when I was from age 12 to 20, growing up. This is the harbor of Crisfield, looking out from Packing House. The big cage on the bottom there would hold 3 barrels of hard crabs or 6 bushels. There's a scale on the left. That was part of my job, to weigh the crab barrels coming in or bushels coming in, and then you tally up what each crabber, and then you would turn that in. And end of the week, they'd pick up their money, and they got paid in cash too. So very important that you get the things right. One of the things they like to do is soak the barrels in water. So pick up a little extra weight that way. You always had to deduct 20 pounds for a barrel.
I'm sorry. So this is, we're still talking about art. And I also want to hear how art, it's pretty obvious the answer to this question, but in what ways has art connected you to the place that you're from?
There were, the first art lessons I had was from a guy who never had any formal art lessons either. So there were a lot of people who had dabbled into art. So it was you had a lot of support that way.
What do these guys mean to you?
Okay, these are probably the best known waterfowl carvers in the world. These are the Ward brothers. They were from Crisfield. They didn't really become famous until they were probably in their late 70s. Then they actually started making decoys that were collectible. And so instead of getting $1 a piece like what my father paid for when he bought decoys from them back in the 20s, then they started getting thousands of dollars. And all of a sudden they became very, very collectible. Last year, one of their decoys sold for over $100,000. So it's, the whole antiques market has kind of taken over this business. But these guys were great guys. They taught me everything. They gave me wood, they gave me knives. They were really great guys. They had, I think they quit school in about 4th or 5th grade, but they read everything, and they could recite poetry for hours because they just learned it by rote method.
So I think it's just important to take a minute to understand that the Ward brothers are I'm going to make another terrible art analogy, but they're like the Picassos of the decoy carving world. They are, the work that they do is top of the line, that they did is known by collectors as the best work in the decoy carving world. And they're from Crisfield. They trained Mr. Dize, and a lot of the knowledge that Mr. Dize got from them was just, passed down orally. He learned by working with them and carving decoys with them. So this is an old tradition in Maryland that started with the commercial industry for waterfowling, which we'll look at, and then kind of evolved into an art. And it's, for anybody in this room who's taken a wood carving class with Mr. Dize or is thinking about taking a wood carving class with Mr. Dize, all these traditions are ingrained in that course that you're taking, and it's not it's not something that you can really learn from a textbook. This is stuff that was just passed down. So I just want to point out how unique that is, and Crisfield is the heart of where Crisfield and Everett and Grace is the other place where there was a lot of decoy carving. So they're like the two kind of central areas where you have a lot of these pieces of art emerging from. All right, let's see what we have next. What did I miss? All right, we're gonna transition a little bit to just working the water in the bay. So you'll see in these next few photos, there's kind of a theme. I'm going to ask the obvious question. What makes Crisfield the crab capital of the world?
I don't know that it is anymore. There aren't enough crabs for anybody to be making that claim. Years ago it was. I worked for soft crab packing house. They handle just soft crabs, and which are a delicacy, even more so now. But on a Monday morning, which crabs shed regardless of what anybody wants them to do, they're going to shed. So Monday morning we would have 2 days worth of shedding. And Monday morning, I remember we went to the depot where all the boats came in from the islands, and we picked up 1,000 boxes. Now, by a box, these are called 60-pound boxes. In those days, they were made out of wood. Now they're cardboard. But they were wood back then, and they each held 8 dozen crabs. So you think 1,000 boxes is 8,000 dozen. And this was just one company that I worked for. Now they were the biggest, but they weren't the only one. So those crabs have to be processed. They're not going to wait. If they die, then you lose money. So we would work from 8 o'clock in the morning until 8:30 at night, and we would still never get through them. Put the rest of them in the cooler, start on tomorrow. Next night would be work until about 7:30, and by Wednesday we'd start catch up. But it's just and that was years ago. It was even a more vast quantity. I had an old man who lived next to me, and when he was young, he made his money going around the shore and netting soft crabs. And he said they would meet a buy boat. We'll see one of those later. Meet the buy boat. They raise a flag and they ready because it was easier for them to come to you than you to come to them. So they would go out there and they'd say, if you grab a handful, okay, that's 1 penny. Grab another handful, that's 2 pennies. He said, make $1 a day or $2 a day, he's lucky. Well, we shouldn't judge too harshly when we start thinking about sustainability. Shouldn't judge too harshly the people of the past. When you see these mountains of seafood and all the statistics that show you millions and millions of bushels, shouldn't judge the people at the bottom of the pyramid too harshly, because they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to make a living and feed their children. People at the top of the pyramid, that's corporate greed that everybody wants to talk about. But the people at the bottom are just trying to survive and live like everybody else.
So that soft crab industry is really, it's always been really well established in that Crisfield area. What is it about the ecosystem there that makes it so good for producing soft crabs?
Well, it's all about grass beds. When crabs are ready to shed, they got to find a place to hide, because when they shed, they're totally defenseless. They have claws, but they're worthless. So for about 5 or 6 hours, they're in a state of total dependence on being able to hide. So they hide in the grass. If there's no grass, there's no place to hide. So that's why so much of the grass has disappeared along Upper Bay. So that's why there aren't as many soft crabs in the Upper Bay. The Lower Bay is just an ideal place because there's still abundant grass beds down there.
So if you've eaten a soft crab, there's a good chance it came from Tangier Sound. This is what it looks like when they're fishing crabs. You go out and you catch crabs, put them into a pen, and this time of year is right when all that stuff starts getting cranked up. So you go down to Crisfield right now, and it's a pretty lively place. Usually, like right when the bugs come out and it starts getting warm, is right when the crabs start shedding. So you've got people around the clock trying to pick these crabs out, because once they shed, you want to get them while their shell is still soft, and then put them on ice. Historically, there was a train line that was just pumping these crabs straight up the spine of the Delmarva Peninsula into Philadelphia from Crisfield. That was the big seafood connection. And that the eelgrass that's in Tangier Sound and is still there today, it's an absolutely phenomenal place ecologically, is what yields all these soft-shell crabs. And it's also because of this ecosystem, a lot of different fishing techniques have evolved. So just a couple things to think about there. So tell me what you're doing in this photo.
This is a painting I did of my cousin and myself one summer I worked with him in what's called peeler potting, and that's the only thing we were looking for were peelers. So you can see there's one crab still in the pot there. It's a male crab. His job is to call in all his girlfriends, and so you leave one male crab in there to do that job. So that's why there's still one there. So our day, we try to do a double duty. Not only catch crabs, we try to shed our own. And so this makes for a really long day. We get up at 4, go down to the place where the crabs are shedding, go through the different tanks that are there, pick out the ones that are shedded, pack them up, put them in the cooler, go out in this boat, and we had 142 or 43 crab pots, drop them over. I mean, real pick where they already dropped over. We pick them up and go through them. So my job here, I'm calling crabs. So as you pick up a pot, my cousin pick up a pot, he hands it to me. I dump it out on a calling box there, and I start sorting crabs here, left and right, and throwing back the ones that are no good. And we can, while I'm doing that, he's going down to the next pot. I'm tossing the first one over, he's picking up the next one, giving me, and we'll go through the whole line like that. So we get back in about 11:30. Now we've got the job, we've got to sort all the peelers that we just caught. So you have some that are ready to bust out right now. You have some that'll be in like 2 or 3 days, some that'll be a week, and then some that are just, what do they call them, snot crabs, because they're snot peelers. But now we've got all the ones that have started to shed just before we left. Now they've shed it. So now we've got to go through and pick up all of those, put them in trays, put them in a cooler, and then take them all and go sell them. So now it's like 1 o'clock, and okay, I'll grab some lunch and a nap. And then at 4 o'clock, come back down to the place, sort through the crabs again, pick out the ones that are shedded, put them in trays, put them in the cooler. Okay. And come back down. When you have a lot of crabs shedded, you've got to do it every 4 hours. If you don't, they get too hard, they're worthless. You can't sell these crabs, they call them bucklings, you can't sell them. Nobody wants them. So you come down at 8 o'clock, do the same thing, and go home, catch another nap, maybe if you're lucky. And then if there's a lot of crabs shedded, you got to come back down at midnight and do the same thing. And you get up at 4. So this is your day, for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it kind of drags you down. But anyway, this was our scene in the Pocomoke Sound, and as typical, people wave to each other when they go by on the boats, at least they used to.
And this is a self-portrait that Mr. Dize did of him and his cousin, right?
Yeah.
So that's Mr. Dize on the right.
The crab buoy you see there on the left has a number on it because they all have to be numbered, but I put the 1084, which was the month and year he died. So, little personal thing.
So we're gonna transition a little bit and just talk about some of the changes that have gone on over the years in Crisfield. And the first thing I want to look at is this graph of oyster harvest. So this is just showing records, historic records of how much was caught. They never had a stock assessment done of oysters. There were a couple times where they tried to do it, but to measure this, a lot of times catches are the best way to assess the stock. So this just shows a gradual decline in the oyster population over time, which was a huge industry in Crisfield along with the crabs. That was always what sustained people in the wintertime. Can you comment on any things in this graph as to why we see this decline?
Well, it's just simple over-harvesting. People just thought it would last forever. And it's the same story with just about any species that gets over-harvested. Nobody can see the big picture. You're always hoping next year would be better.
So you've got a steep decline with over-harvest, and then right around the 1940s, there's also the introduction of a couple of diseases, parasitic protozoa called dermo and MSX. And that kind of kicks in right around here. 1972, there was another big event that we're going to talk about, which was Hurricane Agnes. We'll look at that in a second. But here's something that, you know, as we were putting together these slides and doing some research, we came across that is pretty interesting. So if you look at the oyster harvest in this graph, the next graph I'm going to show is the population of Crisfield over time, and it follows about the same timeline. And it's pretty much an exact correlation. So we talk about cultural sustainability, and cultural sustainability being tied right in with ecological sustainability. This is an example of a community of people that's completely dependent upon natural resources to survive. So again, you see the oyster population decline over a period of about 120 years, and over that same period, the population of Crisfield follows the same pattern.
In 1904, the census in Crisfield, there were 25,000 people living there. It was the second largest city in Maryland, bigger than Baltimore, bigger than Salisbury, bigger than Easton. And so it went from 25,000 to 2,500. So, you know, people just couldn't survive. There's not enough jobs to keep people there.
And if you go to Crisfield today, there's some work being done to revitalize the town, but it almost reminds you of like a mining town where there was gold or silver and the resource was extracted. Now you still have watermen there that are making a living under the circumstances that exist, but there's not enough of the resources to sustain the population that it did before. This is just a chart showing the amount of people employed in seafood industries over time. So obviously, like, if you look at this as a percentage, it's a huge drop because the population of Maryland has increased like dramatically since 1880. But you see 1890, early 1900s was kind of when the seafood boom in Maryland peaked, and Crisfield was right at the epicenter of that. Now we're down to 8,332 employees in the seafood industry. And I would actually like to look into this a little bit more and see like what percentage of those are migrant workers. So it's an interesting stat to look at, and again, kind of ties into Crisfield. So here's Hurricane Agnes. This was I want to say this is somewhere in the upper bay, but can you comment on like what Crisfield, what the bay was like before, during, and after Hurricane Agnes, which was 1972?
Well, Agnes is like the tipping point. Before Agnes, there was a lot of grass beds were everywhere, and eelgrass was 4 or 5 feet tall. It was actually a navigational hazard in a lot of places because it was the water could be 5 feet deep, but you couldn't go through it. But after Agnes, it just changed the total environmental composition of everything. There's so much turbidity in the water. There's so much stuff, even as far 100 miles south like we were, there's still things floating around. There were dead cows floating around, there was furniture floating around, there's all kinds of debris. So yeah, that changes things, and it's never really come back.
So Hurricane Agnes, we've got this dramatic drop in salinity, and that lasts for like a year, where the salinity, just from the amount of water, fresh water coming, overwhelming the watershed, and it had huge implications for the ecosystem. Naturally in the estuary, you have a high degree of resilience for an ecosystem, but this storm in particular kind of, like Mr. Dize said, put ecosystems over a tipping point, and it took a long time for these areas to recover. And when you take into account the land use in our watershed and lack of filtration, the recovery time has been even longer. This is eelgrass. This is what it looks like. It's pretty easy to see why this would be a good ecosystem. It's like an underwater forest. It's where the blue crabs shed, and all sorts of juvenile species of fish live. a lot of the eelgrass, there was eelgrass up here before Agnes that people around here say never really came back. So that was a big change when you're thinking about climate change and kind of what the next outlook is looking like. These big flood events, these big storms are happening more frequently. 2018 is a good example of that. We didn't even have a hurricane that year, but it was the most rainfall that Maryland's ever had on record. And we saw a huge, reshuffling of the deck ecologically after 2018. And again, just an extra rainy year, no one event in particular. So, going along with that theme of change, I'm going to read a quick quote from a book that Mr. Dize gave me. It's an old pamphlet from, I think it was like from the 50s. So it was written by Frank Dize, who's, I'm assuming, a distant relative, called Something Fishy from Tangier. I think they would hand it out to people on the ferry. But it's always interesting to read anecdotal writing, like just to get a taste of what the culture is like in an area. So there's one thing I came across. There's a section that says, did you know that fig trees grow at Tangier? The Tangier is just a few miles too far south for lobster to be caught, and about as many miles too far north for shrimp to be caught. And yet we're in the heart of Chesapeake Bay blue crab and soft-shell crab business. All right, so too far north for lobster, that makes sense. Or sorry, too far south for lobster, too far north for shrimp. This is all based on historic catch and information that's been passed down from generation to generation. Then I come across this article that was written December 6, 2021. Warm temperatures move more shrimp into Chesapeake waters. And if you look into this, there's an emerging experimental shrimp fishery going on in Virginia. And people are making a lot of money off of shrimp right now on Chesapeake Bay. That's never, ever happened before. You've got surveys on the bay that have been going on since the 90s, and the amount of shrimp that are being caught in those surveys has increased 1,000-fold. So it's gone from like shrimping, maybe you might see one or two come in from the ocean every year to like, there's enough here now that we might have a shrimp fishery on the bay, like that's here to stay. My question, I guess, it was like, what would Frank Dize say about what's going on with the shrimp now?
I don't know. Things have changed in the past, and things come and go. Different fish have come and gone. I think that's probably what they would look at it like. They probably would be in denial that the water was really getting warmer.
But at the same time, opportunistic about the resources available, right?
Well, in today's water, you have to be willing to do just about anything. So some of them will turn to clamming with hydraulic rigs, some of them are doing bank traps, and some are doing trot lines. You have to be really versatile to make a living, because it's whatever the market will yield the most for your time.
All right, so I know we're short on time. We're gonna kind of address the obvious here, and then we're gonna get into our rapid fire quiz to finish up. This poster, I think, at least it used to be down in AB, showing sea level rise projections for Chesapeake Bay. Again, Crisfield's down here. Anything that's red is projected to be submerged. That's like 1 to 2 feet above sea level. So any of this stuff that's in red is critical area. That's highest risk for sea level rise, and Crisfield is kind of right in the heart of that. This is just another picture of peeler pens at Crisfield and a dock that's flooded out. So as far as land loss, can you comment on what you've seen since growing up in Crisfield?
Well, I don't know if there's, sometimes we say that land is sinking, and it's a combination of land sinking and waters rising, but Yeah, I know islands that have disappeared in the past 50 years. I know fields that once planted corn in now grow marsh weeds. Those kinds of things. An inch or two makes a big difference when you get to saltwater intrusion. And so you can see a lot of examples down there. And especially out on the islands, you can really see what kind of a difference a couple inches just in water level rise makes.
All right, you ready for the rapid fire quiz? So, the last part of our program here is going to be just we're going to show off Mr. Dize's knowledge of the area, and I've prepared some rapid fire quiz questions, and we're gonna see where we can get. So we're gonna start with boat IDs. Ready?
This is a skipjack, like my grandfather had. This is a bug eye, two-masted skipjack, basically. It's a pungy, it's gaff rigged, still kind of rounded bottom. This is a dead guy's workboat. It's a buy boat. These would go out to the watermen where they were and buy the stuff from them, so they didn't have to come into town. Save time for everybody. This is a trot line boat, or scraper could be the one, because they have low sides, and if you're pulling a scrape across the bottom, you won't have to lift it too high out of the water, because these things are big, they're heavy, and they're full of grass and mud. Quick story about one of my relatives. My uncle was fishing one time, and he saw this guy boat something like this. He had a scrape. His one, it wasn't a big one, it was about a 3-foot scrape. And the idea was, you got your boat all wound up, and you throw this thing out back behind the boat, and it starts dragging up. It goes along the bottom and scoops up mud, grass, and any crabs. So he sees this guy, who's one of my relatives too, throws it down, the boat's pulling along pretty fast, and then all of a sudden he sees the guy stepping in the coils of the rope and pulls him back overboard. So now he's underwater. This thing's dragging him along the bottom with the scrape. And so I was, we got to go over there and get to him fast, because he's going to drown. So they're fired up their boat. They're going toward him as fast as they can go. And while they're heading over there, they see one hand come out of the water. Then the next hand comes out of the water. And slowly he pulls himself hand over hand with this thing dragging on his foot. He said it was the greatest act of survival he ever witnessed. He was in World War II. So finally, one of my relatives reaches over and hits the kill switch on the boat and kind of flops into the boat. And he went over and said, Tom, are you all right? Yeah. So, I sure got one leg longer than the other, though. Great sense of humor.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to hear the story about the church, the Eels. We're gonna quick tangent. It's another good story. Religion is a big part of life in the islands, in Crisfield, and pretty much everyone goes to church. You go to Smith Island, go to Tangier Island. That's the community center. That if I wanted to do an event on Smith Island for some reason, I would go to the church to organize it. So that's just to give you an idea of where the central core of people's lives are. You know the story I'm talking about?
Yeah, religion plays a big part there. Sundays, nobody worked, nobody cooked. My mother wouldn't wash clothes on Sunday. I mean, that's the way it was. But anyway, in Smith Island, they have a camp, what they call camp meeting camp every year, which is a big revival, lasts for 2 weeks. And they have preachers coming from all over, and there's tons of food, and it's a good time. So one day this preacher comes up there and he's exhorting to the crowd. He says, the Lord can do anything. There's nothing the Lord can't do. And then this one old woman raises his hand and says, brother, I know one thing he can't do. He says, what's that, brother? He said, I bet he can't carry an armload of eels upstairs without dropping either one.
Has anyone ever tried to hold an eel before?
If you ever, an eel is the slimiest creature in the bay. And when you see eels and you try to pick up one, there is a way to do it, but it's impossible.
All right, we'll keep going here with the rapid fire quiz.
This is called a drake tail. They stopped making those because it was so much of a problem in the stern. This is one of these punt guns, but this was a multiple barrel one, which really could cause a lot of devastation. Most of the ones were single barrel, and my uncle actually built them for people, and they were outlawed in the treaty of 1912. Anyway, on the Susquehanna Flat, we had vast numbers of diving ducks. You could get pretty close to them in the night on full moon, and they'd fire these things off. And you could kill a lot of ducks with these. And ducks sold, canvasbacks were the prize duck, because they sold in New York. I got a menu from New York, 1898. Canvasback dinner was $3.50. Most everything on their menu was 50 cents. That $3.50 today, I did the calculation in terms of inflation. That would be $120 for your entree. So it gives you an idea that only the wealthy could really afford this, and that's why they were so much a part of people trying to make money.
If you think back to like the Victorian era when this was going on, like basically that was just a bad time to be a bird. You got people wearing feathers in their hats everywhere, and you've got restaurants serving waterfowl on the menu. And these boats were designed to you hear the term sitting duck. They were designed to sneak up on rafts of ducks on the water that were sitting and just devastate the whole flock for commercial purposes.
A single barrel, it gets a lot of, you read the book Chesapeake. A lot of people told James Michener a lot of things that were exaggerations, but he bought it anyway, because I know the people who talked to him. And a single barrel gun, you really could only get about you'd be lucky if you could get 6 to 8 birds in a shot. And you think about the logistics of it and the ballistics of it, so it was really a lot of hard work. And it's hard to get up close to these ducks. And then if you shoot the first time, you're done. But then, they were probably getting 50 cents a bird for them at the time. So that when in a time when people were making $5 a week, it's another way to make money.
I talked to a guy from Smith Island who could use one of these, and I don't know if it was legal because that would have been a different generation, but he had used one, and he said when you fire it, you end up in the marsh. You don't have the boat anchor.
Well, yeah, you didn't want to be on solid ground because the recoil from that thing was pretty awesome.
All right, we'll keep going. We've got 2 more categories to go, so we're going to go rapid fire for the next 5 minutes here. Fish IDs.
This is swallowing toad. They're really delicious. Yellowfin trout.
All these fish have like multiple names, by the way.
Speckled trout, hog choker, spot. Oh, I'm sorry, that's spot. The other one's hard hit. Sorry about that. Red drum, or puppy drum, and black drum, and we call them black girls, or sea bass.
What'd you say, Liam? Yep. Sheepshead.
They were gone by the time I came home. It was a striped bass. Many.
All right. Waterfowl IDs.
Canvasback, redhead, black duck, mallard, scandball, bloody duck, pintail, bufflehead, gold eye, wood duck, woodland, spoonbill, shovel, green-winged teal, green-winged teal.
Nailed it. I'll give him another quiz on the big diaries later. All right, this last category here is Tangier translations. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that Mr. Dize is not, he's from, you kind of have three different, dialects between Crisfield, Smith Island, and Tangier. So part of the reason for me showing the Tangier translations is to show that kind of how unique the subcultures are in Tangier Sound. You can look at an island across the Sound, and you might not necessarily be able to understand everything that they're saying, but you might be able to pick up a few things. So I'm going to go through, so Tangier speak, they kind of got, Miss B and I actually have a whole dictionary of Tangier terms in our office. And they kind of have a sarcasm to their voice, to their dialect as well. They call it backwards talk. A lot of these phrases are really kind of just like cute and endearing phrases that are a result of their culture. Punch star.
I don't know what this is.
That's a flat tire. Ain't hard favorite.
Well, it's pretty ugly.
I'm an attractive person. King nice peas.
Peaceful, calm.
It's a useful phrase when you almost fall off the boat. Iggy. Going to. Huggy. Dirty. A fuzz cow.
It's like a cold. Yeah.
There you go, storm's coming. Gillard Billy Southwester.
That's when the wind's blowing hard from the southwest.
There you go, wind's blowing hard from the southwest. Wool gathered.
Messy.
Confused. Oh, there you go. Yeah, that makes sense. The sea, wool gathered.
Yeah.
Dry as Peckard's cow. I don't make these things up. You're very thirsty. He's got Fredericks. That means he's broke. He can tear up a crab cover.
Break anything.
There you go. Yeah, it's like a bull in a china shop. You have the knees. That means you smell. Hawkins is here. Cold. That means it's cold, and Hawkins is here. In the sweet peas. That means you're asleep in your bed. Spargrass.
Asparagus.
Yeah, that's asparagus. And so that actually, so a lot of this, the language, linguists have gone to Tangier and kind of made some of these connections. Like for this word, in Elizabethan, which was what the colonists were speaking, it was sparrowgrass was the word for asparagus. So that's an old colonial word that then evolved to spargrass. All right, a few closing thoughts, and then we're going to go to our workshops. So, just I want you guys to go throughout the day thinking about our theme here of living sustainably, and thinking about how there's three components to sustainability: cultural, ecological, and economic. Sometimes it's hard to get a feel for what it means to be culturally sustainable and like just what it means to be a part of a culture. And I hope this conversation helps outline, the close connection that people in Maryland have to the environment and what it means to be culturally sustainable. So just some things to be thinking about as we move throughout the day. I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Beck here, and she's going to give you all some instructions on where to go next. Before I do that, though, can we give Mr. Dize a big round of applause?